Hey, welcome to Black Coal Woodworking. My name's Matt. Today I'm making a necklace holder out of homemade plywood. First thing I did was to rip down a part of a log into a really thin strip. It's probably around 3 millimeters or less. Next thing I did was flatten out that log again so I could get another couple of strips out of this thing. I ended up using 3 strips like this to make the plywood. Before I glued them together, I sanded the rough sides just to get rid of the bandsaw marks, and that's really just so they glue up nice and flat. After sanding, I squared up the ends and the sides on the table saw. I cut one of the pieces in half because I need to lay it across the other way. The way plywood's made up is you'll have grain running in opposite directions, and you run that in layers. So my first layer is going to run horizontally, then the next layer is going to be vertically. That's where I cut them in half. And then obviously the top layer is going to run horizontally again, and it will look nice, look fairly normal. So to glue it up, I just spread a bunch of glue on each of the inner layers, and then squished it down with a log and some clamps. I think you really have to make sure you get real good coverage with your glue. As you can tell, I'm pretty meticulous about trying to get every last little bit, and almost turning that piece of wood the wrong way. Clamping this piece up itself was fairly simple. I just wish I would have flattened my log earlier in the process. I hadn't done it here, but I did it later. I did end up wrapping this in some kind of plastic as well, just because I didn't want the log to get glued to it, nor that MDF below. So this is where I ended up flattening the log, and I used bigger clamps because I just needed to squish it a whole lot more. Those little squeeze clamps didn't do enough. What I also found was that maybe my MDF wasn't flat enough, or maybe the log wasn't, even though I'd run it through the jointer. One side of the plywood I'm making didn't get enough pressure squeezed on it after a while, but because I had plastic, it was still wet. The glue was still wet. So I threw it back in the plastic again, turned it around, and then squeezed the other side just as much, and that actually ended up working really well. Now I gotta find a way to do this in one shot, because the whole process ended up working out pretty good, but I'd like to be able to clamp it once instead of twice. After the glue dried, I ripped the edges down just so that they're all nice and square. Nothing was sticking out after this, and it just looks like one piece instead of 3. And there you can kind of see how it looks after that. Kind of your basic looking plywood. Probably about 1/4 inch thick, probably a little bit less. My necklace holder is going to have a couple of dowels that stick through the plywood, and to do that I had to sharpen my spade bit first, and I found that worked out pretty good with the file. You can see that edge looked fairly clean, even though that was a pretty quick shot. The dowel that I speak of is actually me trying to make something work on the lathe. I'm not very good on the lathe, but this ended up working, so it worked out. I made this 1 inch in diameter, and it matched the spade bit I had, so I made sure that with my test cut that I did, I could run it up and down that dowel I'm making, and I got a nice snug fit all along. One little trick I did was to mark with a pencil where the high spots were, and then I could shave it down. Worked out pretty good. After getting my homemade dowel to the right diameter, I used whatever this thing's called, and I punctured some holes in the wood just so that the tip of the spade bit that I'm going to use would fit in there and not wander on me. And then from there I drilled out 4 little holes. I have a piece of wood underneath what I'm drilling through just so that I don't get any tear out, or at least minimize the amount of tear out I get, and that ended up working pretty good, although I did need to do some sanding. Once the drilling was done, I cut a test piece just so I could see how it fit inside that board, and then I knew whether or not I had the right amount of length. And for me, that was actually pretty good. So, time to cut some more. Whenever I make cuts like this, I always try to use a stop block so that my piece isn't resting right up against the fence when it comes off the blade. Sort of helps with kicking out the wood. Alright, it's time to see them all in there for the first time. And I get to see if it fits snugly or not. And it didn't fall out when I picked it up, so I thought that was pretty good, because the glue will take care of the rest. Speaking of glue, I found that if, once I've glued these little pegs, I put them through the bottom, then I don't get glue all over the face of my board. That made me very happy. Now for this project, I decided that wooden crack spackle was the finish for the top. Normally, I would probably do this with another piece of actual wood and make it look a little dressier, but this project's far more about the plywood than it is about the edge banding. To make my favorite finish, I started out by grabbing my wife's favorite pot. I mixed up 1 part beeswax to 4 parts boiled linseed oil. What I'm showing you here is how it sort of breaks down once it gets warm enough. And once it gets warm enough, that beeswax really melts fast. I think it's important to get it off the heat as soon as you can. I mean, we are dealing with oil here and you don't want to heat that up too much. And so I just pour it into a little ceramic jar. Make sure I get every last drop that I can. And then I stick it in the fridge right next to the leftovers. I do that so it cools down quicker and I can use it sooner. This is what the wax looks like when it's come out of the fridge, but not quite set enough. But I didn't have that much patience, so I sort of scraped it out and rubbed it all over this thing. What I really like is how the grain starts to pop when you do this. Probably my favorite part of any project. After rubbing it down with my thumb, I took off the excess wax with the cloth. Here we have the finished product. Pretty happy with how it looks. Again, this was all about the plywood and hoping it stays very straight and flat. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. Consider subscribing if you're new here. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next time.